Is it okay if I start with the...
Yeah, sure, please,
sure.
Go ahead.
So then, welcome all of you to today's event for SILKROAD 4.0. I'm very excited of this evening, or about this evening, because we have an amazing lineup of speakers again. I would like to start with a very short presentation to give you some insights, just a second, about what we plan to do this evening. So you should be able to see the slides on Zoom as well. I'll just go to full screen mode. And welcome to SILKROAD 4.0, as I said. We are on a learning journey to connect the East and the West. And what's quite unique is the first time ever, since we started in September last year, we'll have an on-site event. So the event series will consist of two parts of today's part here at the Hotel Zeitgeist. And the second part is on Saturday at the Göttweig Abbey. And before we continue, I would like to say a big thank you to our host here, Andreas Pulcher, who would like to ask to say a couple of words. Andreas, do you want to come over and just present a bit, because the microphone is here on the laptop.
So welcome to everybody. I just want to use this possibility to say a few words about Zeitgeist Vienna. Thanks, Felipe, that you try with us the first hybrid event here at Zeitgeist Vienna. We opened this conference center last year in August during the COVID pandemic, and are now try to start. So we hope a good time after or with COVID-19. We are directly located here at the main train station in Vienna. We have 254 rooms here, 1,000 square meters of conference area with state-of-the-art conference technique, lighting technique, and we want our guests to feel good here, have a great time here. We have two garden areas that also our guests can relax and go out a little bit during the conferences, during the stay here at Zeitgeist Vienna. And in total we have 53 employees, and we are a very young team, and hope we can satisfy our guests with our service quality. Once again, thank you very much that you are here, and I hope the technique will work. Our staff is here to help if there is something we need to help, and thanks a lot and have a great evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andreas. Thank you. So as you can see, it's like many things with SILKROAD 4.0, a little bit experimental here with the hybrid part. But let's see what the evening brings. I would like to hand over the word to Professor Georg Zanger. So unfortunately, he's not able to join in person because he's on a business trip at the very moment. But he kindly sent a short video message that I would like to show and to play now.
Ladies and gentlemen, as the president of the Austrian Chinese Business Association, I'm very delighted to welcome you to today's event. Digital Silk Road meets sustainability, climate change, and environment. During the course of the evening, you can expect exciting contributions from Professor Murrigan, Lord Giddens, Dr. Ortiz, Dr. Jodin, Professor Lewis, as well as from Professor Reinisch. Since its foundation 10 years ago, the Austrian Chinese Business Association has been committed to promote the cooperation between Europe, in particular Austria, and China. The COVID pandemic has shown that an exchange on equal grounds is essential for Europe and China. I am more than pleased that Austrian Chinese Business Association is part of the SILKROAD 4.0 and wish today's event great success.
So very thank you for the Akbar for joining us here as a local host in Vienna. And as SILKROAD 4.0 always wants to be international, we also want to thank our partner, the BWA, from Michael Schumann from BWA for supporting our initiative. So just a very brief welcome and thank you message from Michael for the next.
Dear Philip, distinguished speakers and panelists, dear participants joining us online tonight, ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to welcome you on behalf of BWA, the German Federal Association for Economic Development and Foreign Trade, to today's event, Digital Silk Road Meets Sustainability, Climate Change and Environment. This is the second time that BWA is participating in this format, and I think this series of events and discussions is a great and much needed initiative. However, I would like to share with you a brief note about tonight's topic. Here at BWA, we have been supporting Sino-German relations since we were founded more than 18 years ago. And we have welcomed the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative from the very beginning. As we all know and have learned from the Chinese example, investment in infrastructures is a key to economic development and the road to prosperity. Triggered by BRI, we have been arguing for quite some time that the task that we are facing in Europe when it comes to regional development and regional integration in Eurasia is to bring the various infrastructure initiatives presented by China, Russia, and the EU closer together, to coordinate them into what could become, so with a hope, a joint connectivity strategy. Unfortunately, these days, the geopolitical framework for this seems worse than ever. We see EU relations with China and Russia deteriorating at a record speed. Instead of more cooperation, we witness more antagonism and a hardening of positions that should worry us all. We need to be careful in Germany and in the European Union not to lose our ability and willingness to engage in dialogue. And that brings me to the topic of this evening. In more and more discussions on relations between China and the EU, but also between Russia and the EU, I see a rapidly progressing speechlessness. And when there is nothing to talk about anymore, when there is nothing people can agree to discuss with each other anymore, politicians turn to climate change. Like, if we can no longer talk to each other, let's at least talk about our common responsibility for our climate and environment. Don't get me wrong, it's great you have set this topic for tonight, but in my opinion, it is not enough. Reducing our exchange on cooperation with China and Russia along the new Silk Road, but also along many other topical lines to issues of sustainability, climate change, and environment cannot be politically satisfactory and must not satisfy us. Let's strive for a bit more than that. Having said this, I wish you a successful event tonight with interesting discussions, new insights, and perspectives. Thank you very much.
So that was a short welcome word from Michael Schumann. And I would like to start just very quickly explaining a little bit more about SILKROAD 4.0, how everything started, just to give you a little bit more background. So the original idea, the underlying question was, what can technology do? And the more you think about it, nowadays it's not so much a question of what can technology do, but if you know the right people, you are most likely to be able to solve any kind of upcoming question. So it's more turning into this, what should technology do? So welcome again. My name is Philipp Reinisch. I'm the founder of SILKROAD 4.0, and the whole initiative started originally in 2016. As I said, the research question, the underlying research question at the time was, what happens if you take modern technologies, some so-called Internet of Things technology, to outside of your comfort zone. So we installed a couple of IoT devices in this very old sidecar, as you can see here. And then I drove around for 2 months in Europe. And then the question came up, so what happens if you really leave your own comfort zone, if you really leave your own ecosystem? And then the follow-up project was then a little bit more extreme. So in 2018, we equipped a motorcycle with a couple of another newer IoT devices, as you can see here. And then I took this motorcycle, this high-tech motorcycle, all the way from Austria to China. And at the very beginning, it started like a one-man's trip, but along the route, I was honored to meet an amazing group of people all along these 20,000 kilometers. And the destination at that time was the Eurasian pole of inaccessibility. For those who don't know that, it's the place on land that is farthest from the ocean. It was more like an arbitrary point on Earth, just to go there. And my mission at that time was to explore along the route what I encounter, or what are the challenges of modern technologies. So the goal is the driving or riding was the goal, not achieving actually this point. And as I said, I met amazing people. I was honored to meet the Minister of Innovation from Uzbekistan, the Director General of the European Commission, and so on since then. And with the help of all those people who are here, and virtually or physically, this whole idea, this whole concept of a SILKROAD 4.0 connectivity platform has evolved. So our mission is to connect people, technologies, and across nations and borders. So just to see some of the faces that helped us to shape this product. Not on this list was, for example, Astrid Skala-Kuman, who I'm very thankful for, who is a very passionate, inspiring person supporting the project, or Harvey Sodin, that I will come back to later, or Don Lewis, or other people. So why I'm mentioning this developments? Because what we have created jointly is a learning journey. If you take modern technologies, the more you think about, or the more you speak about modern technology, the more you realize that technology is not able to stand alone. It always requires a context. And an engineer is not able just to do its own narrow engineering, but it requires a context to really make meaningful technology. And that's why we discussed a lot about what actually means connectivity. And then we designed this route that you can see here, traveling from Vienna to Beijing, arriving in February 2022, where we discussed several topics related to connectivity. And at the beginning, we started in a virtual environment, just this tour that we started in September last year, when the Corona crisis was still on high swing. This virtual reality venue was the only way of really interacting and meeting people. But it's actually not the purpose of SILKROAD 4.0. I personally believe that meaningful connections, it's much more important to have meaningful connections more than a lot of connections. And just to show you what was 1 month ago, it was the first time we did a very small delegation trip from Bratislava to Vienna to the Austrian pole of inaccessibility. It was a 4-day trip together with the chair of the cybersecurity platform of the Austrian government, Thomas Stubbings, who joined me on this motorcycle trip. And the reason why I really enjoy traveling is it's extremely inspiring. So if you're in the right environment, you get insights, you get ideas, inspirations that you can then take and digest while traveling. For example, we also met Alexander Witter, the CEO of Nimbusec, a cybersecurity company, and he told us a lot about private airplanes. And it was incredibly interesting to learn how actually high available systems, like in an airplane engine, are actually very similar to high available computer system. So if you have a CEO of an IT security company talk about airplane engines, it was one of the most inspiring discussions that I've had for quite a long time. So I know that you're not here for my charming smile. So I really want to mention the upcoming route. So as you can see here, today we are in Vienna, as mentioned. I want to thank our partners, BWA and the ACBA, the Austrian Chinese Business Association. At the moment, we are looking for partners who are also interested to organize some local public viewings along the route. I'm in discussion with Berlin. Here in Vienna, we are setting something up. I'm having discussions with also Professor Donald Lewis, who's setting something up on the west coast of the States. So there might be some local SILKROAD 4.0 communities coming up rather soon. If you're interested to partner up, please reach out to me. And without further ado, I want to start now in the core of today's evening, the presentations. I'm very thankful for 3 amazing speakers to join tonight. And I would like to hand over to Harvey Soden and Donald Lewis, who will introduce the speakers and who will help and support with the moderation on site. One important thing, we really would like to encourage our participants, our audience, to ask questions. So we use Slido as a voting tool, as a questioning tool. Professor Donald Lewis, former professor from Stanford, is doing the virtual moderation. And on site with me is Dr. Harvey Soden, a former vice president of ABC Television, also a former personal advisor to Jimmy Carter. And if you want to ask any questions, please feel free to do so using slido.com 40563. That's the code for entering them. Or if you have a mobile phone, you can scan the barcode and then directly arrive at this slido.com page to ask your questions. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Professor Donald Lewis, who will kindly then take it from here. Thank you all for joining. It's a big pleasure to have you all on board. And I'm really looking forward for all these insightful discussions that we're going to have this evening. And Donald, do you want to take over?
Yes, thank you, Philippe. As mentioned tonight, the Digital Silk Road meets sustainability, climate change, and the environment in the lovely city of Vienna, Austria. It goes without saying that the topics for discussion tonight are of historic importance to humanity and indeed the planet itself. They will engender immense dynamic and essential transformations to the world's societies over the next few decades. So I do take some issue with the fact that these are less than entirely crucial topics, as was suggested a little earlier. Critical to our collective success will be the attainment of the 17 SDGs, or Sustainable Development Goals, which Philip has now posted on the screen. And these SDGs are associated with the ambitious United Nations 2030 agenda. And they will be, of course, discussed and part of this evening's presentations. We are indeed fortunate to have with us this evening 3 extraordinary speakers to illuminate such transformational topics. Lord Anthony Giddens, Dr. Ricardo Melendez-Ortiz, and Professor Kathy Mulligan. Our first distinguished speaker tonight is Lord Anthony Giddens, who will give us the keynote address, provocatively entitled The Wake-Up Call, COVID-19, Climate Change, and the Fierce Exigency of Now. Anthony Giddens is a member of the House of Lords of the UK Parliament. He is a former director, president of the London School of Economics, and a life fellow of King's College, Cambridge, where he was professor for many years in sociology. He is the author of over 30 books and co-founder of Polity Press, a leading publisher in the social sciences and humanities. His awards include the Prince of Asturias Prize, the European Book Prize, and more recently, the Arne Næss Prize for Environmental Studies. He holds more than 20 honorary degrees from universities around the world. It is really our great honor to have you, Lord Giddens, as our keynote speaker this evening. Lord Giddens, or if I may, Tony, the floor is now yours.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, or is it good evening? Let me start off by saying thanks to Donald for that fulsome introduction, and congratulate Philippe on this extraordinary enterprise. I'm going to pretend I'm on a motorbike while I'm giving my speech because it will create a sense of movement, but the idea of reconnecting East and West and doing so innovatively, I think, is a very attractive and important one. In 2020, Greta Thunberg went to Davos to meet the world leaders. At that time, Donald Trump was still president. And Greta said to the assembled leaders, look, you've all got together, you've all collaborated, you have a sense of urgency in dealing with the pandemic. Why can't you do the same for the much, much more profound issue of climate change? And I think one can say that this is indeed, in a certain sense, what is happening. If you look at the impact of the pandemic, what has it done to our consciousness? First, it's made us more aware of our own fragility. Second, I think it's made all of us aware about interconnectedness. To me, a lot of this interconnectedness is digital, and I spent a lot of the last several years studying digital revolution and AI because it's so fundamental to what you're doing and to how we reacted to the pandemic. And however, the speed of its spread, reflected that connectedness, because you go back to previous pandemics, none of them ever spread in that way before. And thirdly, it gave us an awareness of the need for global collaboration. And it's not all negatives, because if you look at the amazing story of the vaccines created on something like a global level, I know there are all sorts of conflicts around them. Nothing like that has ever been achieved before. And what happened was that Chinese scientists first of all decoded the genetic structure of the virus within 10 days using AI. And they then posted it, the genetic sequence, on an open access website. And I think the world has to thank Professor Zhang Yongzhen for that. And that made possible producing vaccines on just a huge scale. And admittedly, there are all the questions of inequalities, the less developed parts of the world, mutations. Nevertheless, this is an extraordinary phenomenon. And one of my emphases will be, this is a time of tragedy, yes, but it's also a time of creativity and innovation. And this will be reflected, I think, in how we turn again to the much more fundamental issue of climate change. I mean, Philippe has his tour. I actually have a tour which I sort of pulled out of the parliament a bit, and I decided to do like a world digital tour, giving speeches. I'm not going to include this one, but so far I've visited about 18 countries. And you couldn't have done that before you had this instant interconnection which the digital world makes possible now. I think the result of the impact of the pandemic is we are at a big turning point in history. If I can put it bluntly and use slightly academic language, if you'll forgive me, this is the end of the neoliberal era. This is the end, I think, of the era that free markets have a certain wisdom which human beings are denied, that they should be given free rein globally, and out of this some kind of collective global wisdom will follow. I mean, I have a little responsibility to this because my institution, the LSE, is where von Hayek used to teach, who was the intellectual inspiration for a good deal of new liberalism. But I think what's happening is plain activist government is back big time and on a planetary level. If you look at the EU Green Deal, for example, it's a gigantic stimulus package of, depending how you calculate it, something like 2 trillion euros, quite extraordinary. It involves a proactive reinvention, essentially, of the welfare state, vast job creation scheme centered around renewable energy. Of course, we don't know how it will pan out, but it is an extraordinary transformative moment, I think. You look at Biden in the US, depending on how you calculate it, his recovery package is about $3 trillion, $3 trillion. 1 trillion of this has got through Congress as we speak. We don't know what will happen to the other 2. And even the IMF has advocated a solidarity tax on the wealthy. And what's happening here is truly global. If you look, I think really interesting is the Saudi Green Initiative, which is a huge attempt to plant actually 10 billion trees, not just in Saudi Arabia, but also to try to do so across large chunks of the Middle East. It's spending about 35 billion effectively dollars on renewables, transformation. And then you have China, the new climate change just unveiled. All of these involve substantial amounts of reshoring because the idea is to rebuild manufacture around renewable energy. So they therefore impinge on the geopolitical factors which have been mentioned. And the relationship between these things is plainly complex. And of course, we can discuss it if you're interested. The backdrop to its impact on climate change is, to me anyway, clearly now there is maybe 20 years max to save not the planet, but our civilization. The planet will go on whatever we do, but our civilization is poised on the end of the biggest existential crisis, I think, that it's ever faced. And of course, now there are 8 billion people in the world. Until 1850, there were never more than 1.5 billion. And I think it's not actually rhetoric to speak of a climate emergency in this situation. clearly the relations between the major power blocks will be pretty decisive. The EU and China together account for about 34% of global emissions, so their joint responsibility is huge. China alone at this point still accounts for over half of total world coal production, and therefore has to zoom away, if I can put it there, for a very different base. I should put my cards on the table. I admire large aspects of what China has achieved. No country has ever produced the scale of economic development in such a short period as China has managed to do. Of course, all sorts of negatives do, but it is an extraordinary thing. If I can just mention, I've got a good Chinese friend in London. We drive through London and they have these roadworks that are there, you know, almost permanently. They never seem to do anything on them. They take years to build anything. He says, oh, in China, we would have done that in a week, and we would have done it this way, and we would have built a skyscraper, et cetera, and that is not simply just an observation. There is a good deal of substance in that. I think the Belt and Road squabbles and the clearly geopolitical elements obviously there must not stand in the way of creating a much more profound collaboration between the EU and China on climate change issues. This is just an absolute exigency at this point. This can't be a leisurely affair as in the past. The EU-China partnership on climate change has been a kind of leisurely affair. It dates back to about 2005. To me, it has to be steeply ramped up. And I think Europeans must at this point take the Chinese concept of creating an ecological civilization very seriously. We should recognize that it's quite different from the mainstream ecological views that originated in Europe. For example, I think Arne Næss was maybe mentioned in the introduction, the Norwegian creator of deep ecology, which we can discuss if anyone's interested in the debate afterwards. But the Chinese version of ecological civilization, I think this is right and proper, has technology and innovation at its core, even as it appeals to traditional values to help legitimate ecological objectives at the center of the so-called Chinese dream. So I admire Arne Næss and his achievements, and he's a very interesting figure in himself. He had a rather different version of the motorbike story, which we can always chat about afterwards if anyone's interested. But I would distance myself from his position, and even of many of those in the green movement more generally. I've long described myself as an ungreen green. And I'm in favor of the use of nuclear power, for example, if properly controlled and monitored, because the climate exigency makes it necessary. We have to consider these options. The possibilities of carbon capture and storage on the large scale must be explored, along with other last resort technologies. Nuclear fusion, into which China is pouring a lot of money, is a possible route to providing almost infinite clean energy, in the words of one of its main Chinese proponents. Europe is something like a pioneer in this field, and therefore this could be one site of collaboration. The ITER program is an enormously ambitious endeavor. Its prime physical site is in Cadarache in the south of France. China is actually among the partners of the group of states helping to fund it, and of course has a domestic program which will very likely move much faster. The promise is more or less limitless cheap energy, carbon-free and available on a global level. Could I stress I'm not emphasizing that the solution to dealing with the ecological crisis is primarily technological, just that this is a period of crisis and we have to explore all avenues and assess consequential risks. There is no risk-free strategy when countries collaborate as they must do globally. Now, I understand you'll discuss this in more detail, but COP26 is looming in my country, in the UK. May not be my country anymore because I'm English, and it's in Glasgow, and we don't know what will happen as a result of Brexit, but it's only 4 months away. Can I ask you just to consider something? COP26, 26 years of meeting. And what is the outcome in terms of practical impact? It is not, 26 years of accumulated strategy and wisdom. The first COP I went to several, was actually COP15 in Copenhagen, where they produced the Hagen Accord. That was supposed to actually happen in 2119, but 2119 went by. Now, I think you can argue that COP26 is still very important, and that the sense of urgency is much greater this time for the reasons I've mentioned. That is, much bigger structural changes, a general agreement of an activist approach to the transformations of renewable energy, which we have not seen before. The pandemic has in some part stimulated that, but not wholly. 110 countries actually have now set net zero target for mid-century. And one massive change is that large swathes of the private sector are pushing to be in the vanguard. They've also accepted that the talk of a climate emergency is wholly accurate. I would instance, for example, Mark Carney in my country, who was the head of the Bank of England, one of the best, I think, and is now deeply committed to transformation and is very activist, not only in the UK, but much more generally. The relation between radical innovation, climate change, and geopolitics is going to be really complicated. We all know that, but absolutely central to the unprecedented level of global cooperation needed at this point. And this, of course, has to span both the petrospace and the developed parts of the world. So now we must make this new impetus count. We don't know whether we can, but we must globally seek to do so. I come back to the phrase, the fierce exigency of now, used by Martin Luther King in a very different context from the one we're facing. Today, it seems to me a global slogan for us all. And coming back to Greta Thunberg, she had a striking phrase, our house is on fire. And our house is on fire. If you look to where I used to live, I lived in Vancouver. There's a huge heat wave in Vancouver, Seattle, and the West Coast there. Many people have died actually over the last couple of weeks there. Many fires in California, where I also lived for quite a while. And perhaps most significant, Death Valley recorded the highest ever reliably recorded temperature measured on Earth, 130 degrees Fahrenheit in August 2020. So this is an extraordinary time of a challenge which we have to meet, and we must have cross-cultural, cross-geopolitical collaboration to do so. We all know the issues there. We can discuss them here, but if this doesn't happen, the time will slip away. I think one of the best books that I've read that gives you a sense of the crisis is by a colleague of mine in Cambridge called Peter Wadhams, who was the head of the Scott Polar Institute and is one of the world experts on the Arctic. He wrote a book called Farewell to Ice, and that is pretty awesome in terms of what the consequences will be of the high level of melting which is happening, how far it's got, how it's affected the tundra, under which there is masses of methane. And it's a very good way, actually, of grasping in a sort of concrete sense situation we face. I leave you with perhaps a bad taste joke. Two planets are chatting to one another, and one planet says to the other, "Oh, I don't feel very well. I think I've got Homo sapiens." And the other one says, "Don't worry, that doesn't last very long." Well, as a prompt, maybe that will be a prompt to the kind of collective action we need. Thank you very much for your attention.
Donald, you're still muted. Donald? Donald, you're still muted.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you. Thank you so much, Tony, for that remarkable panorama, if you like, regarding what has been happening globally as far as climate change, and indeed providing us with a wake-up call, much needed wake-up call in light of all the climate disasters that are afflicting the planet right now. I mean, there's clearly much to do, and if we don't do it, as you point out, we are going to be facing, in the next 20 years or so, facing the edge of an existential precipice. So again, thank you so much for that, Tony. And I'd now like to move on to the Q&A with Lord Giddens. My first question, Tony, is this. In your speech, you mentioned the activist state as the primary vehicle to combat the climate emergency, citing the well-conceived EU Green Deal as an example. But isn't this almost exclusively top-down governance by the state?
No, don't mistake me. I'm saying this is a transformation that's happening. It is deeply significant. The world has woken up in a certain sense, and in a very real sense, I think, to the urgency of the climate change issue. And it's the pandemic that has stimulated through the recovery packages this consciousness, but it's taken real form, real shape. No, if you look at the European Green Deal, for example, it places a lot of emphasis on bottom-up participation, places, as does Biden's package, on renewing local communities. Of course, one of the themes, as I've said, is actually making renewable energy a means of reviving communities through reintroducing manufacture, but certainly both schemes imply a lot of bottom-up consultation. You cannot have top-down action which doesn't involve such systems. So that certainly is a part of I think, the initiatives that have been set up. At least we have to see how, of course, they work out in practice. But I think there's something much more deeply structural going on. I mean, as I said, I take, and this will be one of our themes later, I think, very strong interest in the digital revolution and AI, which seems to me fundamentally transformative forces. And they are creating new forms of localized and collective action. You know, for example, you take Greta Thunberg, she is a world figure. You couldn't have become that without the impact of digital interconnection. So it's not just a question of kind of reinvigorating local government, that kind of thing. There is a kind of possibilities of global activism, which we probably didn't have before in the same way. Of course, again, we don't know what the consequences will be, but nevertheless, I think this is very significant sort of transformational phenomenon.
Yes, well, I mean, you did mention that you are going to, or you already are examining this from a, if you like, a structuralization point of view, which of course is your area of great expertise. So we do look forward to that analysis going forward. And I guess I should mention that the top-down approach that we see, at least to some extent, in both the EU and the US, is also the approach that certainly characterizes Chinese governance.
But I don't want to argue that. I want to argue it has to be far more dialectical. That although there is a return to active governance, which is absolutely essential, it must be coupled with the rest of it, with bottom-up involvement, with involvement of social movements, with involvement of local activists, transformation on the local level, as well as interconnection between local and much more global. I mean, you just have to set up all these things institutionally. So it certainly cannot just be, not at all arguing that. What I'm talking about is there is a transformational return to ecological consciousness on a sort of structural level of government. And we haven't had that before in this sense. And it's pretty global because, for example, I went through a whole list of countries. They've almost all got some version of a Green Deal. See, India has a very large one, for example, and you can just list the examples. So this hasn't happened before. This is something different.
Thank you very much for that, Lord Giddens. I don't know if we have time for a second question or whether we should move on to the questions from the audience. Harvey and Philip, can you guide us on that?
Why don't you ask your question, Don? Go ahead.
I can ask another question? All right, good. Yes. My second question for you, Tony, is more lighthearted, but certainly worthy of deeper reflection. And that is, should trees and rivers have legal rights? And I preface this by also saying that when we look back and we examine, for example, Chinese feng shui, that certainly there is a great appreciation given to nature. And this is, I suppose, reflected in the second question.
Yes, I mean, it's on a philosophical level, I think it's worth looking. If you take the example of Arne Næss, for example, as one of the leading thinkers who founded deep ecology in Europe and became a global movement, well worth looking at the possible connections between that and Chinese ecological civilization. But the issue must be to combine that with innovation, to combine that with cutting edge technological innovation. So it's not just sitting there and looking back to nature as it was, but a very different synthesis which we have to come up with today. But I think, you know, Arne Næss introduced the idea that nature should be linked to rights, not just human rights, but rights which affect the existence of elements of nature. And that's been picked up by many people and by many activists. And I'm connected with an organization called Client Earth, which is a group of lawyers transnationally working on climate change issues. And they picked up this kind of theme. You don't treat the earth as a client, but you regard the law as an instrument of enforcing objectives which have positive ecological consequences. So, for example, you must ask questions. A tree has existed for 3,000 years. Should we not protect that tree and enshrine that in law? The Great Barrier Reef is disintegrating. Shouldn't the law have a role in trying to arrest that process? So you're not granting rights to nature directly, but you're certainly introducing the role of law, and hopefully on a transnational level, to try to consolidate some of the main imperatives that have to drive our reaction to dealing with climate change. Could I mention climate change is not simply an environmental issue. It's something simply unique to our period of civilization, which no previous civilizations ever had to face, and where the time envelope is very small. So that's the extent of the issue, and makes it so difficult to cope with on a global level, but it's absolutely essential that we do. And I think this discussion is very useful because collaboration between China and the EU is indeed possible, but it must be more detailed, it must be more well organized, and it must be integrated with the issue of urgency.
Well, thank you very much, Tony. And yes, there is a great deal of urgency here, but geopolitical forces being what they are certainly hindering the development of that collaboration, at least between the EU and China. I suppose we can now take questions for Lord Giddens from the audiences. Over to you, Harvey.
Okay, very good. Lord Giddens, hello. I wanted to convey a couple questions to you, short questions and short answer. Sudhir would like to know, as business leaders and influencers who are on this Zoom, what specifically do you recommend that we can do to promote addressing climate change, which is an existential issue for our times?
Well, it depends which kind of business, of course, but for people, let's say, working in areas to do with, let's say, markets, you have to reorient capital markets towards ecological imperatives, and this is happening in different places at the moment across the world, actually, on a very high level. An awful lot of big businesses in finance have woken up to the issue of climate change and have seen that the world has gone through a turn. This is what I'm emphasizing. It's different from the period even before the pandemic. There is a new sense of urgency in business too. So I think small businesses, local businesses, right the way through to huge conglomerates must treat themselves as actors in this situation, not just stand by indifferently. And as I say, there is, quite a lot of this already happening, and various new organizations and networks set up to do this. And again, collaboration between the EU and China could be a really important part of it, because what China does is so crucial, even more so than what the EU does, because of the size of the country and the speed of its development. So as we all know, China has to reconcile, as it were, completing its economic development with a massive transformation at the same time, getting rid of coal, for example, on which it's heavily dependent. But it does have the political mechanisms to help with that, because there are furious protests now against pollution in the urban areas of China. So there are things like that that can provide leverage, but I think the business community must be centrally involved, yes, and is becoming. And I think, perversely, the sense of crisis created by the pandemic, is my argument, has helped to instill a sense of our fragility, and given us a kind of dynamic drive, which we didn't have before. I'm not denying it's a tragedy, but there is perhaps, this side which could be transformational. That's what we've got to work on, I feel.
Thank you very much. Hassan?
Yes, I have a question.
You're in Amman, Jordan. Do you have a question?
Yes, I have a question, my dear. Actually, it's my pleasure to join you on this session. And you remember I recommended Lord Anthony Giddens to you to be hosted here in this Silk Road project.
Wow, you better be crying now then.
I met you in London. Yes, I met you in London in 2019 in the British Academy with the Chinese dialogue about the peacekeeping. Yes, I remember that. And I give invitation to you, Mr. Giddens, and Mr. Harvey to come to Jordan to host you here to talk about Silk Road and to make more cooperation with each other about this field and others also. My question or my interference in this field, that the government, they have efforts to do for this. Sometimes there is contradiction between the interest of governments and the climate change. But at the same time, why we don't increase the efforts of NGOs about this matter to have a more strong effort to keep or to protect the climate change, like the using renewable things and building green cities plant more trees, like the project of Saudi Arabia and others. All of us, we have responsibility to this question for the next and coming generation. This is not a question of our generation only. We have to protect it for the next generations to come. And thank you for your good listening. Yes.
Am I going to reply to that, or is that?
Yes.
Am I going to reply to that, or was that the end of my bit?
Yes, it's okay. Yeah, you have talked about this planting the trees in by the project of Saudi Arabia and others. I mean, why don't encourage? We encourage all the NGOs and the states to do the same.
Well, indeed. But I mean, you know, as soon as you've got positive examples, they will be pretty influential, I think. So, you know, what happens in the oil states will be really crucial. And that, again, is heavily geopolitical, because you've got the example of Russia, and at the moment, you know, you have the example of the gas pipeline through Germany and so forth. And so these are complex issues, but geopolitics involved in most of them.
Yes.
But I just think that the world has kind of woken up. And, you know, one can't say if it's sufficient to resolve the crisis, but if we don't resolve it, I can't see how civilization can survive intact. I just can't see how it's possible. So therefore, the impetus is, I think, deep. And I think there is, for the first time, you know, a much greater collaborative kind of discourse and intent, but there's a hell of a long way to go, and there's only a short time frame. So it's up to us to build on what's happening at the moment, globally, locally, personally, I think. And I think to listen to the activists, to listen to the younger generation.
Yes.
I think as well.
Tony, thank you. We are running out of time. We appreciate your presentation and your insights. And Hassan, thank you for your question. So now I'm going to turn it over to Don to introduce the next speaker. Tony, thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Harvey, and thank you again, Tony Giddens, for a really remarkable speech and for the guidance in terms of the future and how we need to respond regarding the exigencies of climate change. Thank you again. Our next distinguished keynote speaker is Dr. Ricardo Melendez-Ortiz, a world-famous advocate of sustainability. The title of Ricardo's speech is The Immediate Agenda on Sustainability and Integration. A former diplomat and negotiator on trade, sustainable development, and climate, Ricardo is currently strategic advisor for the Latin Trade Group. He is also a non-resident senior fellow of the Center for China and Globalization, CCG in Beijing, a member of the Scotia Group, SG26, addressing COP26 issues, and co-founder of the very influential Center for Trade and Sustainable Development, International Center for Trade and Sustainable Development, ICTSD. For several years, he co-led with the World Economic Forum, the largest ever research and analysis initiative to examine the future of the global trading system, involving over 400 experts. He's also been an inaugural steering committee member of SILK's BRI's think tank forum. Ricardo, we very much look forward to your remarks. The floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Don, for that very generous presentation, and Philippe for the invitation to participate in this conversation. It is really an honor and quite a challenge to share the stage with Lord Giddens and with Catherine Mulligan later on. Just before I go forward, allow me to congratulate you on the SILKROAD 4.0 initiative. As Lord Giddens, listening to your presentation of the SILKROAD 4.0 initiative, I feel very tempted to join you probably in an electric motorcycle as you go in your tour. So I'm very hesitant to follow some notes that I had drafted for this conversation, because I think this is the tone of it, and rather to try to follow some of the remarks of Lord Giddens. And maybe even before I start talking about the gist of what I thought should be my remarks, just add a couple of things to the questions that were asked at the very end. After obviously saying that it's really a great privilege to have listened to you and your remarks, Lord Giddens. So there was the question on the law that you asked on, and I think it's a quite interesting one to follow up. I'm not a legal scholar or legal expert, but I've been dealing with this legal constructs for so many years, for over 3 decades. And so a very interesting development last week, I thought I'd mention, is that an independent panel of experts led by Philip Sands came out with a proposal for ecocide. So in a way characterizing what should be crimes against nature. And so I think that's very revealing, and it really follows up on what Lord Giddens just said. We have also just seen actions by courts in different jurisdictions in the past few months that are quite impressive. And I think that in a way responds to your question, Don, on how we are now in a way changing hearts and minds with respect to our relationship with nature. I come to this theme really of the conference on sustainability from a perspective really of international relations and diplomacy. So since the late 80s, I have been a negotiator, a delegate, and an analyst of processes of international governance. And by default, but also by interest, I had the privilege to participate in this summitry of the 90s, which, and in a way, I participated as a drafter then of the frameworks agreement that resulted from Rio in 1992, as well as in the Uruguay round of the GATT, which created the World Trade Organization and the conventions on climate change and biodiversity processes, among others. Partly for those reasons, I have felt through my life, my professional life, responsible to proclaim the purposes of those compacts, of those agreements of the international community, and to contribute through knowledge generation and particularly through engagement of stakeholders to the timing of these ideals that are contained in those agreements. Now, thinking about what's the moment in which we are now, governments around the world are sort of gearing up to a new climate summit in Glasgow, one that should trigger the implementation of the 2015 Paris Agreement. In November, that would be preceded by a COP of the Convention on Biological Diversity in Kunming, China, which is very, very revealing in itself that it's happening there in early October, and also by a G20 summit in Rome at the end of the month. Now, as this is somewhat similar in terms of the expectations that are being created at the moment to that summitry in the 90s, and I think also to what we saw happening in the run-up to 2015. This in terms of, again, rethinking global governance. So in 2015, we adopted this new post-2015 development agenda that includes those 17 sustainable development goals that you have mentioned, and a new roster really of international priority that was built as an effort to integrate economic, environmental, and social aspects of development for the years up to 2030 in a way that was universally applicable, which is what is really innovative in that framework, meaning that it involved efforts both in the developed world as well as in the global south. And taking into account, so this is sort of mainstream, the question of different realities and capacities and respecting national policies and priorities. That probably, all this language led to the bottom-up approaches that resulted in the Paris Agreement in 2015. So in a way, it's as if from First, the Stockholm Conference in 1972, 50 years ago, to 92 Rio, 30 years ago, to 2015, governments realized that it would not be possible to resolve some of these issues to simply rely on a top-down approach. This is interesting in many ways, and I'll try to go there, but let me just say that with all the enthusiasm that the 2015 frameworks generated, then COVID happened. And COVID, well, and maybe I should say before that, we also had a bit of a shakeup on the concept of global governance, international cooperation, with particularly the kind of politics that resulted in the Trump administration in the US, and then the stance that the US took vis-a-vis those arrangements that we had had in place since the post-war. So then COVID happened, as I said, and COVID was not an experiment. It was an accident of a major shock, global and locally, affected universally economies and social cohesion in many ways, and obviously health, so life, in a very direct manner. However, what I think we need to do as we think how to move forward is reflect on the lessons of COVID as if it were an experiment. So in a very colloquial manner, we all probably know that if we had suggested in conversation with friends that all aircraft would be grounded in March of last year, or that governments would be coming up with $trillion packages of rescue that they would distribute to people who had lost their jobs or were temporarily out of work, we would probably have been laughed at, but it happened. And I think what is important at this moment is to really try to learn those lessons. We now know what a global crisis looks like, but also we know what kind of response mechanisms we have in place. We also know how able or unable we are as countries to tackle crises of this scale, and what we can do or not together. Also, I think very importantly, it's clear that it was a very big realization that in terms of the governance mechanisms that we have in place, we're not ready. We're not ready to manage crisis in a discrete manner in the various dimensions of global governance. Now, solutions have been put in place, and it's not a question, obviously, of underestimating the scale of those solutions and the importance, for instance, of the efforts to create a vaccine in the way that it was done. But are they band-aid solutions, or are they really systemic change? And if they're not systemic change, how do we move towards that systemic change? And I think, going back to sustainability, well, the concept of sustainability itself is, in many ways, a precept of the need to act in ways that do not compromise the opportunities and the livelihoods of future generations. And that continues to be, in that very simple formulation, probably the most powerful element of that concept of sustainability and sustainable development. If this is the case, we have to think very carefully about the way in which the economy is organized, and let me just put it as that economy, as well as how we relate to nature, and obviously issues that concern our social fabric. Now that's a huge agenda. It is a very ambitious agenda. As I said, it was most of the elements that are really relevant for that agenda were put forward in that 1992 Rio conference and the Rio principles. Even though these conferences and the interaction among governments is by definition characterized by compromises between sort of conflicting and competing interests, but also obviously by the political economy and the politics that are behind the negotiations. But let me suggest that there is a need for us to go back to these precepts. And perhaps this would happen as we go into a reflection on the 50 years of Stockholm and the 30 years of Rio. Now, more specifically, so what happened in those 30 years? And this much, and I would probably spend too long going through a good definition, but the world changed in a big manner. This world of 92 was emerging from a period of economic fragmentation organized at least around three separate development models: the centrally planned economies of Central Europe and the closed economies by and large in the global south that were characterized by import substitution models, coupled with controls on exchange and so on, foreign exchange. And then the transatlantic and trans-Pacific spaces that were driven by a very pungent US post-war economy into what became an amalgamated liberal economy. From 92 onwards, so with the inset of the World Trade Organization and then the adoption of liberal economic models around the world, motion is set towards what looks like a new world, one that could turn into a globalized economy as it gradually did with the integration of these national economies into international markets, into global markets, through an aligned set of economic policies and the frameworks at the governance level that enable that integration. Then, in a way, 2008, 2009 happened as well. And those that critical moment of growth was in a very big manner brought to a stop. Wealth had been created in unprecedented forms. Millions were lifted out of poverty, not least in China, which follow a model race, basically, where it implemented policies that directed savings to go through its own financial system into further investments in productivity, something that is not quite the same that happens in other economic systems or non-economic models. But I think it also, with the creation of wealth, there was a significant cost that came to a great extent due to the lesser attention that was paid to questions of equity and social inclusion, and an underestimation of the persistent and deep-rooted asymmetries in the capabilities among countries at different levels of development. As a result, we face today very difficult levels of inequality, which have been made even worse with the COVID crisis. More interestingly, I think with COVID, those levels of inequality, which were already very high at the domestic level in many economies, and among economies, have now been worsened in such a way that there may be convergence between different strata in economic terms, between, say, populations in emerging economies and the developed world, and while there is a very much larger population that has been left behind all over the place, including in the developed world. And so again, there's much that has been written about this. There was also the high price that was paid as a result of insufficient consideration for the natural environment and the planetary boundaries of Rockstrom, and that we now accept as a priority. So it was an extremely ambitious attempt, again, this idea of sustainable development and that formulation, and then in 2015 of reconciling environmental protection, economic growth, setting broad common direction for policy. But it was also a vision developed at a very turbulent moment, and concerns about global equality, the terms of trade, the anxiety from developing countries about the role in the new globalized world, the predatory behavior of unbridled multinational corporations in many cases in global markets, rules of the game that were inadequate for a globalized market. We have the rules for the liberalization of trade for global markets, but we don't have competition policies. There are some competition policies at the regional level. There are some competition policies at the national level, but not at the global level, just to give an example. So that has also resulted in feelings against globalization. And that is, I think, something that is important to address. But it's also important to address the narrative. Is in my opinion, and let me sort of get completely out of my script here, the issue with inequality and these shortcomings in the globalization process have less to do with goods or services or capital or people crossing borders, and more to do with deficiencies in institutional frameworks at the domestic level. Sort of fast forward to COVID and today, one of the lessons that we have learned from COVID is that resilience probably doesn't come from defining strategic industries, or as some people are now favored to do in Europe and the US, but rather of ensuring that there's a distributed economy, one where resources can be accessed and processed in fragmented methods of production across various jurisdictions. So again, that's the globalization. I subscribe very much to the analysis of Professor Richard Baldwin, who, looking at globalization and the growth of output and the growth of trade and the pace of growth of trade, argues that globalization has not peaked, as many observers have recently sort of claimed. Rather, what has happened is that we have changed the way, again, in which we are globalized, including this question of digitalization that Lord Giddings have referred to as well, and which is absolutely fungible through the whole economy and the global economy. So again, the question of tackling the pandemic has demonstrated that an open economy is probably better than nationalism, than economic nationalism, protectionism, and closed economies. Notwithstanding this, we continue to play with this concept in a way that I think should be an issue of alarm, really, and should be called off. So I think, again, going back to governance mechanisms, we need to recognize that, for instance, the trade system has been put into a very difficult situation, continues to guarantee the flow of goods and services through principles of non-discrimination and contracts, really, that so far countries continue to respect. But somehow we have, as a good analyst of trade recently said, we have crossed the Rubicon when it comes to some fundamentals of the system. We don't have a working dispute settlement mechanism in its full extent. We have a constant violation by major players of the principles of a most favored nation and some of the non-discrimination principles. And we have a system that has been unable to embrace the developments of the new economy, including digitalization, but also, and this is my suggestion, the need that it has to urgently move towards being an enabler of sustainable development. That should be the principle that really informs the development of that system. For that, we need the major players to cooperate rather than operate in conflictive manners, and to coalesce around shared objectives and a shared vision for that governance. Now, very quickly, because I went too much into this, and I wanted to talk about climate change. I think bringing climate change into that story is something that we're sort of living through. So in the next 2 weeks or so, we're expecting that this Green New Deal, which is a very impressive overhaul of environmental policy in the European Union, will result in some, well, I think altogether is 50 new laws, but on the 14th of July, we're expecting about 30 of those to be enacted or to be announced. And one of them will include a carbon border adjustment mechanism. Now, again, I don't want to lose the audience on that, but it is now part of the daily news, this discussion on carbon border adjustment mechanism, and it simply refers to the question of how to ensure integrity in climate action when a certain jurisdiction takes measures through either establishing a carbon price, whether by a carbon tax or creating a market for carbon credits, as the EU has done with the emission trading scheme, or even by imposing standards on the carbon footprint of economic activity, which should result to similar burden, and probably, again, it's towards attaining the same kind of outcome, which is the internalization of carbon cost in production. Now, the carbon border adjustment mechanism is simply a tool to ensure that at the border, the field can be level. So there's a level playing field between importers and exporters, such that the climate effort, so climate action, is not compromised. So there's no leakage, no dislocation of production because of the burden that is imposed to production, in this case, in the European Union. Now, is this something that is WTO compatible or not? And so we're going to hear a lot of discussions on this, and we're already hearing about it. In my view, it is. It has to do with the design. I think that there are many ways in which the EU can do this. There are some people that believe that this is not a constructive way forward to bring the question of climate action into the trade system. I reveal my position here. I think it is. I think that there are ways of designing these systems for climate action that are inclusive, that respond to the different capacities of different countries, that respond very specifically to the characteristics of production and products themselves. There is, in order to make sure that this runs smoothly, there is a need to guarantee transparency. We have gone very far now in technology and science, understanding how carbon is embedded or embodied in products and in production. It should be possible to account and define nomenclature for carbon into products, but that requires, again, more cooperation, and it requires more dialogue. It requires dialogue also between the different silos of governance that we have today. WTO intergovernmental machineries should be put together with the UNFCCC, COP type of intergovernmental machineries, and there should be a dialogue. I believe that G7, G20 really have the keys, and I should say BRICS should have the keys to promote that kind of dialogue and that kind of cooperation. But I think, and I probably try to wrap up here, what we should expect in a post-COVID moment is for the international community to understand again the need to act immediately. And so that's my point with the title and the content of these remarks, is the need for immediate action. We cannot wait another 10 years since, for instance, Copenhagen, $100 billion a year were asked to ensure the implementation of climate agreements and climate action in the developing world. COVID has demonstrated that when there is the will, there is the possibility to generate that kind of funding. We just heard from the G7 about initiatives, including in a way complementary rather than competing, in my view, to the Belt and Road Initiative that are $1 trillion initiatives. And so again, I think the most important outcome that we should expect from Glasgow is a delivery of the resources that are necessary to move forward. Then there is a lot of other detail that we can talk about that comes together with this. But I will probably just leave it here and just think about the anecdote that I keep in my mind when I think about governments getting together and trying to come up with these agreements, which is the many years that I would come home and explain to my children what I do. And they would not understand why there's no action. So they were not born when I started looking into climate change issues. They heard me speak about all this through the years. They're now 28 years old and so on. And they continue to be puzzled about the inability of governments to act when they need to do so, particularly in the interest of the planet and of future generations. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Ricardo, as ever, for sharing your superlative expertise and deep insights with us, particularly in on this occasion with relation to the interrelationships between sustainability and integration, and indeed the way forward in terms of institutional reforms to the global trading system, and in terms of incorporating more fully climate change and sustainability into our international economic order. Let's now move on to our Q&A. Just an initial point that's relevant for the questions. The audience may be interested in an international journal article that we should be posting on Zoom and Slido. Philip is attending to that. Let's move on to the initial questions. My first question, Ricardo, I mean, you have touched on the conflicts that exist between the EU and China, the US, EU, and China. And indeed, even if you like, spilling over now into what was supposed to be a relatively shared agenda with regard to climate change and related issues of sustainability. As we know, there is a controversy in the West over China's commitments to sustainable development, especially in the context of BRI. But isn't it really the case that China is closely cooperating with the UN agencies, UN Environment, UN DESA, and UN ESCAP on the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals, especially through BRI? And in other words, is this criticism justified? And what are your views on the recent G7 BRI alternative initiative centered on supposedly better sustainability policies and practices in the West when compared to China?
So thank you, Don, for that question. I think when the new Silk Road initiative came about, as it was called when it was first pronounced, it took everybody by surprise. And it took people by surprise also because it came with a very large number in terms of investment behind it. So far, I understand China has committed somewhere around $4.2 trillion in investments into the Belt and Road Initiative. That compared to the kind of numbers that we're now seeing tossed about with COVID, of course, becomes maybe it gets into the right scale. It's not as impressive as it used to be. But I do think that there was a lot of concern when the initiative was first announced, and then in the first few years about the sustainability of those investments. Was it about dumping the capacity on infrastructure and steel, cement, etc., of China into certain markets? Was it about political intentions? Whatever it is, it has brought investment where there was none before. And now there is, as you said, not only the UN accompanying the initiative, but also a very large number of foundations from the US and Europe, as well as think tanks that are sort of ensuring and promoting sustainability in the implementation of the initiative. So I try to feel optimistic about these things. I do think that, yes, we need to make sure that we monitor, that there is good understanding of what's happening, and that there's a possibility to intervene whenever possible. And I like to think that the Chinese government has understood that it is in its interest, and it's acting in that direction to support sustainable development, climate action, now nature-based solutions, biodiversity, and so on. That so-called B3W initiative that came out of the G7, which is, I think, what you referred to, this Build Back Better World initiative, which has been championed by the US, I think is very welcome. As it was announced, we don't know the details, but it talks about trying to narrow the 40+ trillion infrastructure need in the developing world. It talks about low-income and middle-income countries as beneficiaries, which I think is also very welcome. It also mentions, at least in the initial document, some areas that it considers infrastructure, which are very different from what we have seen in the Belt and Road. So it's not physical infrastructure, but it's climate, health and health security, digital technology, and gender equity and equality. I take it that climate probably refers to what is perhaps the most important immediate agenda again that we have, which is decarbonization, including a rapid energy transition to low carbon matrices, and so I would just say it is a very welcome initiative. I think it's good if I wouldn't think of it, even though this is the obvious reading of many around the world, and it comes also in the political narrative. I wouldn't like to think of it as being confrontational, but rather complementary.
Thank you for that, Ricardo. Harvey, do we have time for another question from the moderator, or should we move on to the audience questions? Harvey, are you there?
Unmute, Harvey.
Okay, I think actually we should move to the next speaker, to Kathy, and because we're running a little bit late. But I have a very quick question for Ricardo, and it has nothing to do with what he spoke about, but it has to do with the background on his screen. What are those sculptures? I'm really interested. I think our audience is interested too. Tell us about that.
This is, I decided to use today the dining room in my house. And so this is very old. When I started my career, I worked in Thailand with refugees and in Laos and Sri Lanka and so on at that time, Cambodia. And so this comes from that time. And so they're flying dragons. I'm glad you
All
like them.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. Okay, thank you. And we're looking forward to your participation again in a little while. Don, back to you.
Thank you, Harvey, and thank you so much, Ricardo. Our third distinguished speaker is Professor Kathy Mulligan, who will kindly provide us with a timely intervention entitled Blockchain and the Opportunities and Limitations for Achieving Sustainable Development, with, I might add, a special focus on smart, sustainable cities. So we do look forward very much to Kathy's intervention. Kathy is currently Professor of Computer Science at the Instituto Superior Técnico, I hope I pronounced that correctly, at the University of Lisbon. She is the director of the newly established lab called Decentral. She is also an honorary senior researcher at University College London in the Department of Computer Science, and she was previously co-director of the Imperial College London Center for Cryptocurrency Research and Engineering. And very much like the two previous speakers, Kathy does speak widely internationally and participates in a whole range of international initiatives, particularly those related to blockchain. So Kathy, it's a great pleasure to have you with us this evening. The floor is now yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you very much for inviting me today. And my apologies if I look slightly tired. I had my second jab, so I'm feeling just a tiny bit sluggish. So if I look like I'm about to fall asleep, my apologies, guys. So and also thank you, to various distinguished speakers. I feel like I'm not qualified to speak after both of you. So thank you very much for the opportunity. And I'm going to do something which I'm kind of a little bit famous for. I'm going to make some very provocative statements that are going to hopefully either get people talking or get people throwing things at me. One good thing about digital is you can do these things because it's all remote. So I really liked both of the points that Anthony and Ricardo brought up, and I've been taking copious notes here. I think it's really interesting that we're all talking about Greta Thunberg, and it's fantastic that we have such young people who are so passionate and involved. But you also, Ricardo mentioned 1992 Rio, and of course, in 1992, there was another young woman. She was 12 years old at the time, Seven Kulis Suzuki, I think her name was, probably not pronouncing it correctly, but she was there in 1992. And, I was just about to leave high school. I left high school in 1994. And I remember, watching that on the news and everyone going, isn't it fantastic? We're all going to listen to the children. Well, I think we really haven't, have we? I think we've kind of failed on that. A little bit of background about me. I also I did engineering for sustainable development in 2005, and that's a big driver for me in the background of what I do and how I approach things. And one of the things I've realized is that, quite frankly, I think it's too late. I know that's very provocative for many people to say. We have been talking about these things. 1992 was many years ago. Now I'm very old. I'm so old, my hair is grey enough that I can dye it blue with no problems at all, right? It's because it's grey underneath. So I think that the issue for me here is it's almost like we keep talking. I really liked your comment, Anthony. I've written it down, COP26, it's 26 years of talking. It's not 26 years of accumulated actions. And so one of the things I do with, and I try to use digital technologies to investigate, is how can we actually cope if it is too late? And I know I know everyone wants to talk about mitigating climate change, but I feel that we're almost too late. We've been talking since the Club of Rome. We've been trying to talk about these problems and trying to get action happening. And I think there's something really interesting about this, that everyone talks about the speed of technology, being so fast. It's actually too slow. It's literally too slow. And I think we're now at the point where the world is going to, and I mean the planet that you were talking about, Anthony, suffering from being sick from Homo sapiens, is now, it's too late. It doesn't work at the pace of human governance mechanisms. And so what now you're all probably thinking, what aren't you going to talk about blockchain? So let me turn to why I think blockchain is important. What blockchain actually does, and one of the things I've been looking at it, in the perspective I've been taking on it, is how can it help us create those decentralized, loosely coupled interactions that Ricardo was sort of talking about. So for example, a blockchain enables you to create a form of re-territorialization of your supply chains to ensure that they're flexible when it needs to be resilient. So for example, we will see, because of these massive heat waves, they're going to get worse. They might get, we might see more storms. As a result, our supply chains are really monstrously brittle because they are incredibly globalized. And these technologies allow us to bring flexibility and a bit of, resilience into those networks. So how can you think about doing more locally produced products when required, and use those global networks only when necessary? And that will also actually, over time, hopefully, reduce the CO2 outputs that we're making. So I think we need to do both. We need the very top-down approaches that all of the governments are talking. We must continue on those, but there's also these concepts around technologies that we can use to create our own resilience. And so the other thing I was thinking about, and I was asked to talk about a little bit, is this idea of how can we use it in smart cities. And there's lots of different ways we can think about using digital technologies, in particular blockchain. So what can blockchain do? We've seen a lot, and I remember that Philippe, at the beginning, you were talking about the IoT revolution, which everyone thought, was going to save the day 10 years or 15 years ago. And one of the biggest problems was the data that came off those networks. There was no way to track it, trace it, ensure that it was reliable, etc., etc. Using blockchain, you can do those things, and you can do those things in a secure manner, which allow people to connect in different ways. It can allow people to share data about healthcare and or environmental issues, in their local areas without invading privacy. So these are the kind of tools and techniques that blockchain will give you and gives you access to, if that makes sense. And I think there can be a lot of, and we do see actually quite a huge number of new blockchain projects that are sort of emerging. They're really at trial stage. And what I think we need to do, in particular, when we look at the European Union, is ensure, I love this idea of the green growth agenda that they've got. But again, if you look at how they're putting that out, it's all in silos. And what we actually genuinely need is a systemic approach to solving or interacting around these problems. So driving a truly interdisciplinary agenda is really important. Not just in the academic sense, because I know a lot of people talk about interdisciplinarity from an academic perspective, but really genuinely from an actual real day-to-day perspective. People in corporations, people in government really need to learn and understand these technologies differently. So they were just a couple of interventions, provocations, I would probably say. But I also wanted to point out, I was really enjoying that motorbike trip that you were talking about, because on my wall, I have a picture of Stephen K. Roberts, who was the first guy who traversed all of the United States from one side of the other on a home-built bike. And he did it in the 1980s. And it was the first sort of gonzo engineer. So look him up. Maybe you can kit your bikes out with some digital tech too. And thank you so much for the time. Happy to take specific questions on how blockchain can help.
Thank you very much for that, Kathy. Harvey, what does our schedule look like right now? Do we have time for a few questions, or at least one question for Kathy?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, very good. Well, I have a question.
Sorry, yeah.
I have a question. On the issues of sustainability, which of course have been the subject matter of tonight's discussions to a large extent. How can blockchain actually be used to advance, I mean, specifically advance sustainability in smart cities? Kathy, did you hear that question?
Sorry, I was on mute. My apologies. I was talking away and on mute. So I think that, you know, blockchain can have a number of different perspectives, can help in a number of different ways. So, for example, you know, if you are a citizen needing to access different types of services, you can do that in a privacy preserving manner. You can use blockchain to store the transactions around IoT data. So, for example, if you are collecting lots of data around, I don't know, air quality, you can use the blockchain in a very specific way, for example, to ensure that the data is valid, that it is data that it comes from where it is said it comes from, so you can check its veracity, and you can also check that it hasn't been manipulated in transit. So there's lots of different ways that blockchain can help. And what I view, when I was on mute, I was sort of saying the way to view technology, blockchain, is it's a type of new way to store transactions. So I know a lot of people talk about blockchain as a thing in and of itself, but blockchain is useless without all of the other technologies around it, for example. So yeah, so it can, it can also, for example, one specific, very, very specific example that I've done a lot of work around is looking at how it can create what I call micro supply chains. So, for example, in particular in the United Kingdom, what you have is very large globalized supply chains that create a lot of economy of scale pressure onto their suppliers. So, for example, they force the price down on peas. So, for example, in the United Kingdom, it is no longer economically viable to grow peas, and they all come from Kenya. Actually, most of them in most of these sort of major supply chains. What you can do is use blockchain to create micro supply chains. The biggest problem for SMEs in that sense, if you get lots of small farms, their problem is ensuring that they can supply into large customers at the right speed, at the right quality, and at the right scale. But by working together across the supply chain of smaller farms, they are able to make those guarantees. So what does that do? That creates a re-territorialization of the growth of peas, I don't know, which means that you can have resilience through having the flexibility. And it doesn't mean that you don't buy Kenyan peas, for example. It means that you're able to buy both. And I think that's what in particular we've been looking at. There's lots of different examples of micro supply chains like that, in particular in the smart city space. Sorry, that was an extremely long answer.
A couple of quick questions, or is it not allowed?
Go for it.
Allowed.
Oh, sorry.
Absolutely.
I think it's allowed.
Certainly from Lord Giddens.
Well, just quick ones. I think it's really, really interesting. I mean, but blockchain emerged from the dark web, and there is another side to blockchain altogether because of its impenetrability and privacy. So how would one relate those two? Because the dark web has all sorts of transactions going on and is full of climate change deniers, actually. And second, can one learn anything from Estonia, since Estonia, has used blockchain in this amazing way, and this, as far as I know, the most advanced country in terms of integrating it into its governmental systems?
Yeah, so two really good questions. Firstly, it didn't really emerge on the dark web, but it is extensively used by the dark web. It emerged in the very end of 2008 in response to the global financial crisis. Actually, there's a lot of debate how it emerged. You are correct, however, that it's like anything, all tools can be used in good and bad ways, right? So computers are used in good and bad ways, both by, in any situation. One of the problems, I think, and I think you're probably referring to, is the use of Bitcoin to, as ransomware, for example. That obviously is a big problem, but it's not a big problem, it's a relatively big problem, but there are companies that have solutions to do that. And one thing I'd like, people say blockchain is anonymous. It's not, it's pseudonymous, and you can be found, you are not anonymous when you purchase with Bitcoin. And there's fantastic examples. So for example, the Silk Road, you can see, some beautiful visualizations, how the FBI traced everybody using their Bitcoin transactions. And it's a fallacy, really, that it's anonymous. And, nothing, well, you must know, Anthony, I won't lecture to you, but, you know that nothing is anonymous, right? So, with enough data, you can work out who somebody is, even if the technology is designed to be anonymous. And sorry, what was the second question? I've forgotten that one.
You're muted, Tony.
Sorry. Whether there's anything in what Estonia is doing that could be done for the rest of the world in a profitable fashion and might overlap with the general themes we're talking about. It's amazing how they've integrated it into the governmental system.
Yeah, and it's fascinating. Estonia is a really incredibly interesting case study, also from a geopolitical perspective. So if you talk to them and you go and talk to the government there, they will admit that they created a lot of that because they wanted to be able to keep running the government if Russia invaded. And they've pioneered this fantastic thing where they have digital embassies. So they have entire copies of the every single transaction in the Estonian government running in different countries, actually linked with their blockchain solution. Because they're obviously very worried about invasion. So it's fascinating, that geopolitical interaction. But Estonia's blockchain solution is, it's really good. It's really, really functional, and it was visionary, actually, I would say, at the time that they implemented it. So for those of you who don't know, the Estonian government basically have an entire infrastructure, and you only enter your data once. If you go into the DMV in Estonia, you may tell them where you live, and then every single agency is able to use that system in a secure fashion. And it's not blockchain as you and I would call blockchain. What it is a sort of hash tree. So they use a couple of different techniques that are similar to blockchain. But the biggest issue with the Estonian solution, because, obviously initially everyone was very interested in maybe using it elsewhere, is the fact that it doesn't really scale particularly well. And that's a bigger problem for blockchain in general. They don't scale fast and they don't scale well. So using them in limited scopes and, I think is important to assess where it's actually useful, if that makes sense.
Thank you very much, Kathy. I think at this point, we really do need to move on to the last segment of the program. And again, thank you for your fascinating and illuminating remarks. But the last segment is our panel discussion. And this is where...
Forgive me, I have to leave at this point, so...
Right.
Thoroughly enjoyable, and I hope we can all keep in touch. And I enjoyed it a lot anyway. So congratulations to everybody involved.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
They say good night, yes, but it was very enjoyable, and we must try and keep in touch. Yeah.
Very much look forward to it. Very much look forward to it. And thank you again for your very, very insightful remarks on climate change and related topics. But this the panel discussion segment is to really get your views, the speakers' views on one particular topic, and that is what can Europe learn from China and China from Europe? And we've already heard a range of comments on the current geopolitical situation with respect to not just to the EU and China, but the US and others. So it's perhaps particularly apropos that this is our final topic. Harvey Zoden is with us as well as co-moderator, and he's joining in on the discussion. Tony has had to take his leave, so can we pass the baton over to Ricardo to hear your views on this important question?
Well, thank you, Don. I'm going to improvise, but just from the discussion that we had, perhaps, let me go back to some of the themes that we have touched upon. So let's start with something very little. Kathy was talking about blockchain and the use of blockchain, and so there's some work in China, some of it led by IBM and the Energy Blockchain Lab, which is looking at creating a blockchain platform for trading carbon assets in such a way that they guarantee transparency, ensure that transactions are valid, they're settled automatically, and so on. So that's that kind of I mean, the Chinese scale is quite interesting. Their approach to carbon trading is different from what we have in Europe. At one point, we need to fuse and get to a point of harmonization of all these different schemes and approaches, and that's what I meant before. And so let me jump into the question, for instance, of the CBAM. And so what I think is that what's going to happen in Europe already this year, we have seen the price of carbon and carbon credits go up in a absolutely fantastic manner, now above 50 or even 60 euros per ton. And while the approach that the Chinese are following will keep the price for the moment at somewhere around $5 per ton. And so again, we need to find a way in which perhaps through these exercises of the border carbon adjustment or so on, there could be learning on both sides about the different approaches and then a move towards some convergence. That will be very important for the rest of the world, given the importance of both economies for the global economy. So that's something that is quite interesting in that space of lessons. I mean, there's so much that we can talk about, but let's just stop there for the moment.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. Kathy, do you want to express your views, your perspectives on EU, China, and the way forward? I realize we're running up on time here, so if we could have just some of your brief insights.
Yeah, I'll be very brief. So, you know, I really believe that we need to forge a path forward together. I think there's a lot of interactions that, you know, we could usefully have together. And, you know, I'll leave it there because I could go on forever, but I'll leave it there. Sorry.
Thank you very much for that. And I note that our organizer, our leader, as it were, Philippe has appeared. And Stefan Horvath is now present. Stefan, did you want to present some views?
Actually, I had a few questions, and I would like to talk with Anthony about that, because he made a very good remarks about working together with China. But when now Ricardo is there, he mentioned before in his speech that the new G7, the B3 agreement, is complementary, right? And I agree with that. But I was really curious before I made remarks, and I have now the chance to ask Ricardo, why do you think this is complementary, and where do you see probably the chances to work together? I mean, that both are coexisting and working together on one Silk Road?
So I think that the quick response to that is spatial. So what I mean is geographical, right? So when the Belt and Road Initiative was first launched, it was more, I think, in its original vision, it was a bit more constrained. It was about really connecting China with Europe, and then the maritime part of it would connect with the Indian Ocean and perhaps the east of Africa. But then everybody got so excited about it. I remember when I participated in one of the summits with heads of state from all over, certainly from Europe, and then all the UN agencies. This must have been around 2014 or so, and then everybody was basically asking, can I be a beneficiary? And so the project, what it was extended even to Latin America, and then the whole of Africa, and so on. That what I heard in the past few days about the G7, the idea is that it is global in scope, the G7 initiative of this B3W. And so it will go from Latin America and the Caribbean to Africa to the Indo-Pacific, and so on, depending on obviously the G7 own areas of influence, each of the G7 countries' areas of influence. And so I think that's the first thing, that the geographical, that they need to complement each other. And I don't think that, I mean, again, we haven't seen the details, but I don't think that the idea here is to abandon the regions that are sort of the primary cover of the Belt and Road Initiative. So in that sense, I see that there would be a need there for complementarity. But the second thing is again the sectors and the focus, right? So while one is more focused on physical infrastructure, or has been, the other seems to have this very large and I think very wise concept of infrastructure, which again includes climate and health and digital technology, gender equality. Okay, digital technology, that's where probably everybody's thinking that's where the competition is going to come about. And I think, again, what we're going to see, I mean, we have seen the skirmishes and we've seen the tensions in the past 3 years or so there, and they're very serious. I think it is in nobody's interest to really have a fragmented, decoupled a technological move going forward. And so my optimism tells me that we're going to get to a point of convergence. And there must be a way to find the security and the trust that is necessary to deploy different types of technologies, also the interoperability of the technologies, but also the various components. That there are several initiatives, as you know, already in place for this, and such that governments can actually supply their own technology from whoever provides it efficiently and at a high performance in the market, and then combines the different components. And so again, I think we're moving towards there. Maybe I'm too optimistic. Maybe some people would think I'm naive, but I think that it's a matter again of deepening cooperation to get to that type of world, a world that is more cooperative rather than competitive. Competitive is okay as long as you have the rules in the so that the negative spillovers of actions in one jurisdiction are neutralized or taken care of in the rules. But conflicting is probably not in the interest of anybody.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Because I also agree in what you said about it could be a complementary approach. I see it more as you said, the Chinese built infrastructure projects, right? Mm-hmm. And to be honest, just compare a Beijing airport with a Berlin airport, and you know mm-hmm. who is better in building infrastructures, right? So it's no doubt that the system there, for whatever reason, works way better. right? And that means also that they are using their export overshooting exports, which they collected, and the money from that, yeah, for investing, which is, when it compares to a lot of European companies, also a very smart move, because investment is investment in our future. Investment is investment in reducing poverty, like you said before. And to be honest, if you build something in Bangladesh, right, they might not reach our level of wealth that we have here in Europe, but you can't compare that with that. I think we really have to compare them with where have they been before, yeah? And if we stop now this trade, right? Or if we ask small countries like Bangladesh and say, you have to decide, right? So between us and them, yeah? It would be really not only a hit to our economy, because it will be, let's say in the case of Bangladesh, very hard hitting our textile industries, right? Or the garment industries. But also it would not be really fair to the people. So as you said, the way working together, yeah, is obvious that you have to do that at some point in time. And as was mentioned before, climate change is currently the largest common ground you will find, right? And I really hope that could be a nucleus where others can add and work together. There's just one thing I would add, and it's not nearly related to climate change, but could be. For example, in Europe, there's so many companies extremely good in wastewater management. We worked on another project with some of them, right? They're small and medium businesses. They won't have the outreach to go somewhere along the Belt and Road, but there are so many places along the Belt and Road where their sanitation processes or where the clean water processes could be used, which instantly contributes to SDG 6 or SDG 14.
Absolutely.
Right. So I think it's working together, as you said, collaboration and competition, both is good. And let's hope that there will be more collaboration and always competition, because the better system may win.
Just one quick point there, if I may, Don, is because I think it's important, and it also, I think, is critical to what you just said, Stefan. And it's that I understand that this B3W initiative, that as opposed to the Chinese Belt and Road, aims at catalyzing private capital. So it will raise actually capital in private markets, but it will also bring in blended finance and so on to projects, which would probably then be also more favorable in certain ways to, again, European and other providers of technologies and goods and services.
I would like to add one remark that I found quite unexpected, I would say. So as you might have known from the news, China did crack down the crypto mining in China. So within China, it's forbidden to do crypto mining. So one of the reasons is the overboarding energy consumption / the environmental impact of crypto mining. And funny enough, it's now moving to the States, as I read. So it's funny that actually the Chinese are doing something against this CO2 pollution. And where do all these miners go? To the United States. I think that just tells a lot of stories how the world has been shifting within the last couple of years. I noticed that we are running very late. So I'm very, very grateful for all of your great inspiring remarks. I really appreciate all your times, your efforts, especially the speakers that were extremely insightful today. It was a really great pleasure and a very big inspiration for me. I'm just looking at Harvey. Do you want to say something? No, he's looking at the watch. At the clock. So thank you, Harvey, and especially also a big thank you for Don, the scientific mastermind, so to say, of today's evening. It was a great pleasure to have you all here. And I just want to quickly show you the upcoming route, because if you are interested into the Silk Road and in particular to people-to-people connectivity, our next event is taking place on 29th of July in Zagreb. And on 26th of August, we are going to Budapest and we'll talk about mobility and transport, especially focusing on rail. So we're still looking for speakers and also for local cooperation partners. If you know someone who might be interested, please reach out to me. A big thank you to everyone. And yeah, I'm looking forward to see you all soon again. And please follow our newsletter, subscribe to our newsletter, follow us on LinkedIn. And a big thank you to everyone. Bye-bye.